Finally, here it is, my quilted glasses case sew along. To start, you'll need 2 pieces of your outer fabric, 5.5 inches wide by 8.5 inches tall, and the same with 2 pieces of wadding. You'll want 2 pieces of your lining fabric, 4.5 inches wide by 7.5 inches high. And for the piece that's going to hold the clasp, you want 2 pieces, 5 inches by 2.5 inches. Now, I like doing a contrast piece with the lining fabric, but you can either do the lining fabric or the outer fabric. It's entirely up to you. You'll want one of the snap clasps, and I'm going to link these in my Amazon store because they're not obvious what they're called when you're searching online for them. If you want to add a hanging loop, cut one piece 3 inches by 2 inches and get your hardware to go with it. We're going to start by quilting the outer, so I fold it in half to find the centre point, and then I mark this with my heat erasable pen. Place the outer piece on top of the wadding and just pop a couple of pins in to keep it in place. At the sewing machine, if you've got a quilting bar, now's the time to use it. I like to set it at about 1 inch apart. If you haven't got one, you can just simply draw the lines to follow. I'm doing straight stitches down, or you can do crisscross quilting. It's entirely up to you, and I'm using a stitch length of 3. Keep going all the way across, and you don't need to back stitch at the beginning or the end because you are going to be trimming the piece down to the same size as the lining fabric. Once both pieces are quilted, go back to your cutting mat, and now we are going to trim it down. A lot of people ask, why don't we just do it the same size to start with? And that's because when you're quilting, the piece does shrink slightly, so it's just easier to start larger and then cut it to the exact size you want after you've done the quilting. So you'll now have your 2 lining pieces and 2 outer pieces, both 4.5 inches wide by 7.5 inches high. Set those to one side, and now we're going to do the 2 pieces of fabric that hold the clasp. Turn the piece over, and you want to fold the edges in 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch again. Clip them in place and just take the clasp and just check it should be the same width as the fabric. Once you've done both pieces, we're going to head to the sewing machine and just top stitch them down. At the machine, just remember to set your stitch length back to 2.5, and you want to back tack at the beginning and the end, and you're just top stitching that in place nice and neatly. Do that on all 4 edges of the 2 pieces. And head to the iron and give them both a good press. Taking one of the pieces, you want to fold it in half, wrong sides together, and give it a press, and do the same with the other piece. Back at your cutting table, take one of the pieces and fold it in half right sides together, trim off any loose threads like I'm doing here, and then you just want to put a tiny snip in that centre piece just so that we're marking the centre point, and do that with both pieces. Now take one of your quilted outer pieces and do the same thing. You want to fold it in half and just put a tiny snip so that you're marking that centre point. And what you're going to do is you're going to match up one of the pieces that you have just been sewing, and you're going to match up that centre point with the quilted piece's centre point. Clip it in place and do the exact same thing with the other outside quilted piece. Set them to one side, and now we're going to do the hanging loop. Now you don't have to add a hanging loop, so if you don't want one, then you can just skip this part of the video. To make the loop, you fold the fabric in half, wrong sides together, give it a press, open it out, and then fold and press in the 2 outer edges and fold them in half again. And that means you've got no raw edges, and then we're just going to take it to the sewing machine and top stitch it just down that open edge so that it's closed. And it will look like this. Fold the loop in half, and we're going to put it onto one of the outside quilted pieces of fabric. Make sure you've got the loop into the fabric, so you've got the raw edges on the edge that you're clipping, and I like to position mine just below that fabric that's going to hold the clasp. If you want to add a label, now's the time to do it as well before you sew the whole thing together. Head to the machine, and just with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, so just on the edge, you just want to tack that loop, and if you're putting one on, the label in place. Now it's time to attach the lining, so take one of your lining pieces and flip it over so that the fabric's right sides together, and clip that in place, and do that on the other piece as well. And we'll head to the sewing machine and sew them together with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Starting with a little back tack to secure your stitches, you want to sew along and do the same at the other end. And you want to do the same with your other outer piece. Open it up and just check everything's sewn together nicely. With the seam allowance pressed down towards the quilted side of the piece of fabric, just top stitch all the way across, just at the top of that quilted side of the fabric, not on the lining piece. And it will look like this. And do the same on both sides. So again, flattening that seam allowance towards the quilted piece, turn it over, and then you're just going to top stitch along the top of that quilted piece. Now we're going to pin the two pieces together, so putting them right sides together and lining everything up. You're going to start with those centre seams, make sure that they're nicely aligned. Pin those in place and do the same on the other side. And you'll see that I'm making sure that the seam allowance is towards the quilted end, not towards the lining piece. Then lining everything up, you just want to put pins and clips all the way around. Now just mark a piece down the side of one of the lining pieces, and that's where you're not going to sew. You're just going to sew all the way around and leaving that gap, and that's where you're going to turn the whole thing the right side out. Starting at one side of that space that you're going to leave free, you just want to do a little back stitch to lock the stitches, sew down, and when you get to the corner, you want to pivot and keep sewing all the way around. When you get to that middle bit, you'll be able to feel the fabric loop that you've got, which is where you're going to put the clasp in, and just make sure that you're sewing to the right of it, so you don't want to sew it closed. You'll be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Ignore the one on the video because it's slightly bigger, and I realised it was too big, so I cut it down in the measurements I've given you just so that the finish is much neater. Sew all the way around till you're back to the other side of the space that we're going to leave and back stitch to lock the stitches. Before we turn it out, we're just going to clip the corners. Just make sure you don't clip into the stitches. Now for the fun part, just find the hole that you've left in the lining and just pull all of it gently through so that the right side is now on the outside. Get your chopstick and you just want to poke those corners out so that they're just nice and square. Head to the iron and give it all a good press, and make sure where that hole is in the side seam, you just turn it in and give that a press, because what we're going to do is head to the sewing machine, and with a stitch length of 1 we're just going to sew that hole closed, and it will look just like this. And then you want to turn that lining into the outside, and we are almost finished. Get your trusty chopstick so that all of that lining is sitting nice and square against the outside piece. And now it's time to just put the clasp in, and you'll need to find there'll be a little pin in the bag that they come in. Get one of those out and pop it safely to one side, and then with the two open ends you just want to feed those into the loops that you've created. It can be a little fiddly, so once you've wiggled the two bits through, just place them together, and then you want to pop that pin in, and then you'll see there's a little kind of lip that you just need to press down. I just use some pliers. And then just give it all a press and just check everything is working and looking gorgeous. If you added a loop, you can add your hardware now, and then you have finished and you can admire your gorgeous quilted glasses case. I hope you enjoyed my sew along. If you did, please do like, share, follow for more, send me pictures of your makes, and so I can keep these sew alongs free. If you would like to, you can buy me a coffee and the link is in my bio. Thanks and happy sewing.